Hi everyone to a brand new episode of Women of Community Banking podcast. I've got Radha with me today. Hi Radha, how are you doing?
How's it going?
Okay, can't complain. One really tired after a week long travel, multiple cities, but good Monday afternoon. Looking forward to close the day in the next half an hour. So can't complain about that. But again, thank you Radha for showing up, for making time for us today to talk to us and do this pod with us. We appreciate it.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
Quick introduction who Radha is. Radha is CIO of Affinity Plus Federal Credit Union. And another backstory, I reached out to her, I think 1.5 years earlier, and she told me that Anurag, I need some time. So I was actually after her life, right, for the last 1.5 years to be on the podcast, and finally, very happy to host her in one of the episodes. Quick introduction who Radha is, apart from being a CIO of Affinity Plus Federal Credit Union. Very similar background, right? Even Radha comes from outside the credit unions, spent close to 3 decades in technology across bunch of verticals, starting with healthcare, retail, manufacturing. She's a huge proponent of STEM education and a supporter of STEM education. And obviously, by default, a servant leader, right? She's a huge believer in servant leadership. Radha, I know this can be just a 5 minute introduction for the amount of work you've done. But I'll take a pause. If you want to maybe add a couple of points if I've missed, that would be fantastic.
I think you summed it up pretty well. The idea of being in multiple verticals. I've done a lot of consulting work earlier in my career and then, moved into leadership roles in full-time roles and stuff like that. So the idea of change and being very change agile and a natural sense of curiosity is another thing that I hold very near and dear to my entire career, as well as how I end up living my life. So those have been the hallmarks, the curiosity, the learning agility, and ability to just like jump in spaces where I had no business of being in. And learning from it has been very much an underpinning throughout my career.
I'm sure. Let's talk about your journey. I mean, you come to this country almost 3 decades back, doing your master's, building a new life from scratch, like all of us have done, right? So, what has been your journey so far? Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, it's just, this is like, dating yourself, right? This was pre-internet. That's when I moved to this country. I was, someone who's always lived in the house in a very protected environment with very little life experiences. But my rebellion was moving across the world. So I moved to the United States to get my education, to continue engineer by training. No surprise there, I guess half of us are that, it seemed like, but nevertheless, an engineer by training. I moved to Iowa of all the places. So talk about cultural shock. That was the biggest cultural shock for me. But beautiful Iowa State, go Cyclones. That was probably the biggest shock and transition for me as a young person. I was barely 21 when I moved to this country. And so adjusting to a brand new lifestyle, going to school full time and ensuring that I was doing well in school and taking care of myself, all the things together just helped me grow as a person, like tremendous growth in that first year of learning how to survive and how to thrive. Had to change from survival to thriving. And so that kind of those formative few years when I was by myself and eventually I met my husband and we got married and I moved to Minneapolis from Iowa. So we've been in the Midwest, the great North ever since. And my entire career has been in Minneapolis. Overall, it ended up that, consulting taught me a few things in terms of being very quickly to show up in a place and really understand the lay of the land and understand where the focus needs to be prioritizing. And as leadership opportunities started happening, it's really important to understand, what good leadership and what resonated with you along the way and what you want to carry along as you become a leader, right? Those were the things that I was able to take all along and took every opportunity that was open to me with the same amount of enthusiasm and energy to ensure that, I did the best I could. If I show up at 100%. Otherwise, I say no to not showing up. It is really important that, I give my all anytime I say yes to something. So those have been the key areas and key things that I have been able to leverage and grow and strengthen along the way, and it has always helped me in my personal as well as professional life.
Yeah, that's an interesting immigrant journey, that I can sense. That's interesting. I think all of us have similar journeys, and glad to hear that it worked out for you, right? That's very important. So rather moving on to the next question, right? So what pivotal moments in your career shaped your path to becoming a CIO? Because you spent a considerable number of years in consulting, then moved on to the industry. It's an interesting shift that you've done, right? So if you want to talk about that.
Certainly. I think, the very first one for me was right in the school, right? When I am a civil engineer as a undergrad. So I moved to actually do environmental sciences, and I got introduced to computers and the computer science world as part of my research. I had to do a bunch of classes, and I ended up getting a minor. That was my first foray into this whole world of computer science and technology based living, and that kind of almost set the tone for the rest of my career. What I started out with, I fell in love with something else along the way. And I think, the beauty of this country is, you can pivot and reinvent yourself many, many times over. And that, I think, was the very first turning point where I did my internships in more technology based companies. So it became more apparent that that is where I was leaning. So once I graduated, I ended up taking, it was really important for me to get a lot of different experiences. And one of the mentors, I had told me, well, I think you should think about consulting. You have the personality for it. You should go and become a consultant. So I ended up when I moved to Minneapolis, I ended up doing that, ended up taking a consulting role. I think, that was the first piece that really did give me a very large canvas and learning, in terms of multiple companies, multiple engagement models within those companies, and even like the DNA of the companies, right? Each company has its own little DNA. Understanding very quickly what made sense for me, where I knew I could thrive, where I can add value. That's the second piece that I would say. The third piece was my first full-time job actually started out as a consulting. And I ended up with I had my second child at that point. And I was like, I'm not interested in, coming back as a consultant because, with two careers, it was really difficult for us to manage. And we have no family. All our family lives out east. So we were by ourselves. So that was when they made a job for me because they were like, we don't want to lose you. So come, if you're looking for something full time, come, we'll have you come into a role. So they created a role for me. I landed there. And that was my first full-time job, not knowing how long I was going to last because till then it was consulting and I loved consulting. But I ended up in a place where I knew I would thrive because they were very, good in terms of how change was managed, how, people moved around and grew and had different experiences. So it was a really good experience. Very quickly, I became a people manager very quickly there. It also became very apparent for me once I started talking with leaders that I needed more business savviness, to be effective as a technology leader. So they sponsored me and I went and got my MBA. And that kind of helped round out my journey in terms of my learning. That kind of helped me to move into larger impactful leadership roles where I knew very quickly what I'm supporting my peers on and what their challenges are that I need to support from a technology standpoint. I would say those might have been the biggest pivotal roles. And the last thing that I would say is probably how I ended up in a CIO role. I was not there's this big plan that I would become a CIO. It was never that, as opportunities looked interesting, I took the next opportunity with no game plan. And one of my mentors, who was my manager at that point, she was like, you're ready. Why are you holding yourself back? It makes zero sense. And she was the one who actually recommended me for my first CIO role. So I didn't even know if I was ready for it. She was the only female leader I had in my entire career. She was the one like, you're ready. You should do this. Don't hold yourself back. So those are probably the biggest ones that I can think about. Think about technology being where I ended up landing, consulting to full-time leadership roles, getting my MBA so I could be an efficient partner as well as a leader for my teams and my peers. And then, at some point moving in, taking that big leap and saying, okay, I'm going to take the CIO role.
Yeah, I think that's something I need to, maybe spend some time with you because I have still not been able to move out of consulting, and I think I'm a consultant for life. I don't even know if I can do anything apart from consulting.
I
So
mean, if
that,
it's working for you, let it work for you, right? I have very specific reasons why I wanted to move out of consulting. It's always, I can see myself once I retire. Who knows? I might end up becoming a consultant again.
yeah, once a consultant, always a consultant, and that consultant's philosophy is always there whenever you wear multiple hats. Now, the interesting part about this podcast is we celebrate women leaders of community banking, right? Essentially, uh, you had a very uncommon, for lack of better words, journey, coming to credit unions because I mean, similar to you, I mean, I never heard about credit unions until I came over here 2.5 years earlier. It's completely new ecosystem. So what brought you to the credit union movement and what keeps you here?
It's early days, so I am hoping, I could have a long storied career, in the whole credit union space. I think, it was joining the credit union was a serendipity. In all honesty, I was looking at multiple roles at that point, to get my next role. I've lived in Minneapolis for over 2 decades, almost 3 decades now. But I live on the west side of town, and Affinity Plus did not have a lot of presence. Today we have a lot more presence, but I was not very familiar with them. So a recruiter reaches out, and for me, I really thought that it was a mistake because I said, listen, nothing in my career was financial. There is no banking in my background. I've done a lot of things. Banking ain't one of them. And I've always worked in very large for-profit organizations. So this not-for-profit piece is also brand new. But he was very convincing. He was like, I want for you to come just meet the leaders. And then, you can decide, we believe that you would be a right leader for the opportunity that we have. You should come at least meet with them. And I think that was my willingness to jump in and not freak out about, okay, I don't know what this is. That is muscle memory from all the things that I've done previously, right? So I was like, let's go check this out. And it became so apparent what a wholesome ecosystem this is. I think, that's probably, it's graceful, wholesome, very
Sure.
kind environment that I've not experienced before in my life, so it became more and more attractive for me. It was like this collaborative environment, leaders who think about the greater good and always thinking about members and having members and employees be at the same level in terms of how we make decision that is longer term, not immediately based on every quarter earning, right? That's what I lived with. So all of those things were extremely attractive for me. More than the technology part of it, it was the softer side of the environment that was extremely attractive for me. And I ended up taking this role instead of the other two roles that I had at that point. And I think it was, again, if you ask me in 5 years' time, I'll probably tell you that would be another turning point in my career.
So at least you have a breather from quarterly revenue target role right now. So I mean that I'm really happy about you that you're doing this role and you're helping the community, right? And you're helping the community of Minneapolis that you've been through. You stayed over there for almost 2 decades. So combination of you liking this role plus doing good, right? I mean that's what keeps you going. That's interesting. In terms of leadership lessons, Radha, you talked about, my question would be what leadership lessons from your journey, right? You've got a long journey.
Mm-hmm.
Do you rely the most today? Because, for example, one of my leadership lessons I got when I was in Accenture, like 5 years back, one of my bosses told me something and I remember that still today, right? You can pull up leadership lessons as dated as possible, but what are those that are still with you?
I think I'd probably highlight three different things. The first one is when it comes to people you manage and you lead, not everybody is the same. Not what resonates with you would resonate with them. Not what resonates within the teams too could be different. So there is never a one size fits all. It is really important for you to kind of know them as people before you can effectively lead them. So I do spend that time. Do every one-on-one I have. I do spend enough time upfront, to catch up on a little bit of what's going on in their personal lives. And I'm very transparent. I do the same thing about my life too. So I think, that builds a rapport that's helpful in terms of what would resonate with this person. The second thing that I would say in the same token is how I run my career or how I lead my career might not resonate with somebody else. So it becomes really important to really understand what are they looking for, what their definition of success could be very different than mine or the third person, right? So those are the first things that I would say. No one size fits all. The second piece that I would say is being very clear in terms of how you communicate and how you set the tone of how you want something to be done, where you show up for collaboration, where you make a decision to be able to kind of say, hey, this is the direction we're going. You're setting the direction. There is, from an input standpoint, there is little input. So understanding and balancing where you need to set the tone for somebody to drive along with you and where you want to be collaborative and get the voices into the conversation so the product would be slightly different. Understanding that is also a balancing act. It is not science. It is more of an art. And the last thing that I would say is you cannot control everything. Years back, somebody told me this. I almost look at things as like concentric circles, right? There is like this small core that you can actually impact, you can influence, you can actually make sure the direction and outcomes can be controlled. And that's a very, very small thing that all of us have to deal with. Then the next concentric circle is probably where you can influence the outcomes. Maybe, you have the position or you have the experience, whatever that could be there, where you can have a circle of influence what you are able to influence. But the vast majority of things in your professional and personal life have very little that you can control or you can actually manage to the outcomes. But unfortunately, most of the people spend most of their energy on things that they cannot control anything on. And so I ask myself anytime I am in a situation, which circle am I fighting against? And if it is anything that I don't have in control, I make peace with it and I move on. And that actually helps me leave a lot of clutter out of my head. And I am able to be a better leader for that.
I think that's an art, right? How to remove things that you cannot control and focus only on things that are controllable. Got better at it, or I'm getting better at it with my current boss. So I work with Shishu Srivastava. So he is very good in removing the clutter and focusing on that. So that's something even I need to learn out of, but that's table stakes. Unless you're able to do that, you can never become an effective leader. Emotions don't have any place in running a business as well as whatever you do, right? So that's really important. Moving on to the next question, I would say more of a deep dive on Affinity Plus, right? In terms of digital transformation, right? So it's a very misused term that consultants have been selling to everyone for the last 2 decades, right? First was digitization, then came digital transformation, and now AI, right? I mean, it's just waves of jargons that are flowing across the decades, which I hate to say, but that's reality.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of digital transformation, my question is, what is the biggest digital transformation priority for Affinity Plus right now?
The one thing I would say about Affinity Plus is the leadership had the forethought to put technology as a strategic enabler. So as a result, there have been investments already made even prior to me joining 19-20 months back. There was a lot of investment that was made within technology. So the good news is I am not digging out of a big technology debt, that most of the organization end up in. And, that I'm very, very grateful for the foresight the leadership at Affinity Plus had, and I applaud that. From a digital transformation standpoint, we have solutions. We have spent a lot of energy in implementing technologies. Now the transformation comes by harnessing those collectively, right? We have a lot of different investments we've made. For me, that transformation is more about taking and optimizing our technologies and ensuring that those technologies can actually give you oversight that's not siloed, and it gives you an oversight of your member, oversight of your outcomes in a more holistic manner. That would include, how do you kind of do it almost from a value stream standpoint? How do you look at your member in a holistic manner? How do you offer products and services with the right amount of associated with that member? Those are the pieces that I would say are the next frontier for us to be able to leverage what we've invested in and be able to tell that story of how we are able to manage to outcomes. And that is where AI helps. There is obviously lots and lots of compliance, as you can imagine. And how can we use technology to help enable some of the compliance components while balancing the risk and security? And that's going to be a never ending story that we'll continue to do with it, whether it's AI or cloud first or whatever else might be happening within the space.
That's a very well-rounded answer. I mean, these are very good points that you made, Radha. Moving on to data, because that's what I do for a living. I mean, data scientists have to talk about geeky things. Obviously, this podcast is not talking about data, but still, I try to get a data question in every interview that I do. Now, there are two ends of the spectrum. One is, yes, you have data.
Uh-huh.
You sit on a gold mine of data. Second is actual execution. I mean, actually putting a roadmap and executing those use cases one by one. So, where do you think is the biggest gap right now for credit unions? If you were to take an example, I know you're new, but still, in the first 18, 19 months, where do you see is the biggest gap of doing things, I mean, actually executing things and having it with you?
I think, there is just a lot of opportunity from a data governance standpoint, right? There's just everybody's hearing AI. It's great, but if the underlying data from accuracy, completeness, and governance is inaccurate, that does not help you move forward. I think, there is just a lot of opportunity in terms of creating a more holistic oversight there's tons of data. Now, what is your heat map of accuracy and completeness of that data? Do you have duplication in your data multiple times over for whatever reason? Being able to understand your data taxonomy and its overall DNA and putting a governance around it, whether it is data stewardships or good overarching data governance, both for your transactional data as well as your operational data, I think is probably one of the most important things. It might not be as exciting as AI is or some of the other buzzworthy things that are happening in the environment, but it is a foundational element that will pay for itself many, many times over. So I would certainly believe that, that is a gap. There's data, but how well we understand that data, what kind of investments have been made in that data to be more wholesome, and you're able to make, data converted to information just in time is probably where the biggest gap is.
That means I still have a job to do for the next decade. I'm happy about
I think so. Yeah, I would say, unless, there is an AI tool that shows up and very quickly ingests data and, spits out a data governance plan, you should be okay, I think.
Obviously, I hate to use the word AI because I come from an era of doing analytics, where I still talk about analytics and I talk about data science. Talking about let's talk about analytics use cases. AI use cases can be very misleading. But what do you think? What are the top analytics or data science use cases that you think, if you do an Affinity, will have the most impact in the next like 1 to 1.5 years? It's a broad-based question, but still.
Right. I think, there's just the many spaces, but I'll think members first. Maybe, that might be the most impactful. I think in understanding, we are in a lot of lending. We do a ton with our members. I think being able to understand a 360 on your member interaction life stages and being able to effectively, we take pride in being a partner to our members versus being a transactional relationship, right? So being sometimes what a member is going through or what specifically is happening within their lives, we might or might not understand, but there is a wealth of interactions that happen with this member along the way where we can show up better as partners by leveraging that data. Obviously, within the realm of compliance, we want obviously very compliance heavy lens that we use. But I do believe, there is a huge value. Who do you pre-approve? How are you able to provide the right kind of a pre-approval just in time when it is relevant for you. That probably is an important thing versus, trying to do larger campaigns which are not relevant for maybe the member that it is being offered at. How many of us have pre-approvals that come through and you're like, you don't even give it a minute because there is no relevancy associated with it in your life right now, and you toss it into your recycle, right? How do you effectively manage to it so the members really feel like, oh, they know how they can show up to better my life is probably one of the most important things. The second piece is, being able to, this is where it's an interesting thing. How do you proactively look at a member if they're getting on hard times, right? How do you, rather than do it in a reactive manner when they are behind a payment or two, versus how can I help? Hey, I see this. How can I help you? Let's figure something out. I am showing up in your quarter. I'm showing up on your side. It's not about anything predatory, right? That's something, our members love us. It's amazing if in the NPS scores we get, how often members say, we love you. That's the word that gets used. So we really want to make sure that, we proactively show up again if you're in hard times. So relevancy is important, proactively supporting members when they are maybe potentially taking for a turn for, a little more challenge in their lives, some headwinds. How do you effectively manage to it and be able to support them so they can weather that storm the best way possible financially? I think those are. And then the third piece that I would say, obviously, internally, there's just plenty of operational opportunities in terms of how we are able to leverage data in terms of introducing new products and services and, where those gaps might be in our portfolio, et cetera. That's, again, a third piece that I would say from a data standpoint.
So my last question, Radha, one is, it's not easy to attract and retain talent at credit unions because it's a highly competitive market. One, because of the pay, and second, because of the top opportunities outside. So how do you essentially attract and retain talent at the credit union? It's a very difficult topic.
I think, this is probably a little more easier for me at Affinity Plus than any other place. I would have agreed with you 100% if I were any other place. That statement would have been very, very accurate, right? The good news is Affinity Plus is an organization that absolutely lives on its core values and its vision and its purpose. Authentic way in which we manage and how that culture has evolved along the way, thanks to the leaders and thanks to the senior leadership team that's been there with immense amount of tenure, right? That tenure piece is a very common thing top down at Affinity Plus. An average IT employee, what is it? Maybe 5 years, 6 years is probably exemplary, right? In terms of, what the average tenure for an IT employee is. Our IT employees probably have an average 13 to 14 years in their tenure. So it's more than double the industry average. Why is that? That's because our organization attracts a certain person. Cultural fit is an extremely important piece of how we hire. We don't hire just for a technology. We don't hire for just a competency or a capability. We also spend an immense amount of time onboarding people based on cultural fit as well. That's the number one thing I would say. The second piece is the protecting of that culture on an ongoing basis, right? We obviously have this tremendous culture that's enviable, but how dedicated we are and how focused we are to continue to protect it, empower it, and strengthen it on an ongoing basis is another piece that I would say. And if you do any research, we show up on best places to work on a very, very regular basis, whether it is how we attract people that are cultural fit, how we have some of the greatest benefits I've ever experienced in my life, and how we empower them along the way in terms of their growth opportunities, how we ensure that, there is enough training and ability to grow their careers here. If somebody has been here for 20 years, doesn't mean that they've been in the same job for 20 years. They've experienced many iterations of their career within Affinity Plus. So I think those three pieces, I would say a strong culture, an amazing benefit package that we have, and a very strong focus on individual growth and ability to make those growth opportunities happen, whether it is through learning, training, or experiences, is something that, we feel very proud of that culture and ability. And I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of, the kind of turnover rates we have and the kind of, tenure, we end up enjoying. Now, everything comes with its pro and a con, right? This is a fantastic pro that kind of, when it comes to technology that moves very quickly, sometimes, we need to spend that additional time to ensure that, we upskill our employees on a very regular basis. So that's probably a very minor downside, but that I don't even consider that a downside. I see it as a continuous growth and focus on learning, which is part of, it used to be our core value. Now we expanded it to curiosity. So learning with curiosity embedded in it is essentially part of our core value.
If you look at that, we talked about 13 years. That's fantastic. I know other credit will have similar numbers, but I did this numbers coming consulting where the average employee life cycle is 3 years. What more of that?
Right. I'm not even talking, consulting obviously comes with a much shorter, there is a certain amount of burnout that happens. I do believe we truly have been blessed with like very strong, culturally aligned employees that very much have bought into this ecosystem and what the value we provide to our members. So this idea of, purpose-driven employment is something that lives very strongly with Affinity Plus.
Good. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.